Hi you guys, so I have a couple of things to go over in this video. The first thing I want to do is talk about the short story you guys just read by Flannery O'Connor. You may read that before or after you watch this video, that's fine. But I just want to give you a few of my ideas about that short story. I've already got your discussion board and quiz ready for it, so you can, take those things. You'll have all the way till Monday to do that work. But I also want to talk about the rest of the class, like throughout the end of the semester. So we have about 7-ish weeks left in the semester, if you count Thanksgiving break and after. So I'm working today to get everything that you need to know how this class is going to be finished, posted to Coursden. So maybe I'll talk about that first. So what I'm planning to do between today and it may take me until tomorrow, but I'm trying to get all of the content that you need, including essay prompts and discussions and assignments, all that stuff I'm going to get posted to Coursden today, today or tomorrow. So it'll look like a lot of stuff that's getting posted at once, but I just want to have everything ready for the end of the semester. I kind of got a little bit behind this week and didn't even realize it by not having posted the Flannery O'Connor stuff until today. So that means that there's no time for you to read it before class tomorrow. So that's why I moved tomorrow's class to not meet in person, to just do this work online. Now, when we get back together next week in person, I've posted this on an announcement, but I'm going to be screening a documentary about Flannery O'Connor in class. I can't assign you to watch it outside of class because it's actually not available online. I actually own the DVD of it, so I'll be playing that in class. So no class this week, but if you come next week, you're going to get to watch something that you wouldn't otherwise have access to because, like I said, it's not available online. So we'll get to have some time to discuss Flannery O'Connor then as well. What follows after that is the second response paper for this class. You just wrote one on Sweet Home Alabama and S-Town. I posted the grades for those last week. The second response paper is going to be similar in format, but it's going to be about Queer Eye and the short story you just read from Flannery O'Connor. So like I said, similar in terms of talking about two different texts. The third thing that's due in this class and the final thing is something we haven't talked about too much, but it's the paper that you're going to write based on your interview with someone who you know who lives in the South. I talked about that with S-Town in particular. Brian Reed comes to Alabama and interviews John B. and kind of does like an ethnography. If you know what an ethnography is, it's like where you go and spend time with people, learning about them, and then you write about that experience. An interview is not the same thing as an ethnography, but it's the same spirit. You're getting to get to be around people and learn from their lives and their lifestyle, like what their experience has been like. So you do need to go ahead and be thinking about who you want to interview for that final project. Like I said, this week, hopefully the end of today, you're going to have all the instructions for that stuff. So I'll have the prompt posted and the little essay building assignments that go along the way with that process. But for now, just kind of be thinking about who would be somebody that would be willing to let you interview them. And, it could be a family member, it could be somebody else's family member, it could be a friend if you need to, just somebody who's really, the goal is to find somebody who's grown up in the South and has an experience of living here, and we're going to ask them some specific questions about what that's like. So that's kind of like the nuts and bolts stuff. I'm going to transition now to saying a few things about the short story that you guys read from Flannery O'Connor. So in the discussion posts that I created for this that I'm going to release with this video, I mentioned that this short story is the most difficult thing that I'll have asked you to read in this class. It was written in 1940, I'm going to say the wrong date, 47 or so. Looks like here actually the first copyright's 1946, so I think that's about when this was written. It could have been a little bit later though. So it's kind of a little bit older. It's written in a very literary style, so it's not necessarily written to be consumed easily, but actually a little bit more intellectually, I would say, is kind of the format, so that makes it a little hard. And then it's very symbolic, which can make it difficult to understand too. So there's a lot of metaphor and a lot of like philosophical symbolism throughout the story. So I'm going to talk about some of the things that stand out to me as a reader. I also mentioned this in the discussion post, but I've read this story probably something like 10 times or so because I teach it a lot and I've had to read it for other reasons. Like when I was a student, I read it and just here and there. So I've read it a lot of times, but I still, when I go back and read it, like now for this class, I still find myself a little confused often because there are a lot of different ways you can interpret the meaning in this short story. So if you're feeling a little confused, don't worry. I still am like, I'm not always 100% sure exactly what's going on or exactly what her intention is every time I read this. It changes a little bit for me. So I want to talk about the main characters as a way to start this conversation. So you have the grandmother who, she's kind of the protagonist. The text starts, the grandmother didn't want to go to Florida, so it kind of starts from her perspective. But then you have her family, so her son Bailey, his wife, their 2 children. And the premise is this family is going on a weekend or like a day trip. So they're going to Florida from Georgia, and the grandmother says, you know, we shouldn't go there. We should go to East Tennessee. First of all, that place is better than Florida, East Tennessee, for whatever reason. And also she wants to stay away from the misfit. So the misfit is this criminal that she's heard about being loose from the federal pen, which means he's escaped from prison, and is on the run headed towards Florida. So she's a little bit afraid of this figure that she's heard about, like on the news or whatever. They end up going to Florida anyway, because that's what has been the plan. And what happens, ironically, I guess, on that trip to Florida is they actually run into the misfit after their car breaks down. The story ends by the misfit and the grandmother kind of having a confrontation, and the misfit kills the grandmother. So that's really just the premise plot-wise. And that's a pretty simple story. A family's going on vacation, they run into a criminal, the criminal kills them. But there's so much more happening beyond those things. It's not as cut and dry. So one of the reasons that I am particularly drawn to this story myself is, you know, the title of it is A Good Man is Hard to Find. And in thinking about the characters and thinking about the grandmother and the misfit in particular, you can kind of see why she might have chosen that title for the story. So the grandmother thinks that she's a really good person. If you look on like the first couple of pages where the grandmother is getting dressed to go on in the car to Florida, it says the grandmother settled herself comfortably, removed her white gloves, put them with her purse. The children's mother had on slacks and had her head tied in a green handkerchief, blah, blah, blah. But the grandmother, her collars and her cuffs were white organdy, trimmed with lace, and at her neckline she had pinned a purple spray of cloth violets. In case of an accident, anyone seeing the grandmother dead on the highway would know at once that she was a lady. So she's very concerned with her kind of properness. And we talked about the idea of a Southern belle in this class a couple of times, and how that was sort of like, we talked about that being like kind of modest and, just being overall kind of like put together, I guess, and like in that sort of, we looked at, I think, a picture in class or 2 when we talked about Sweet Home Alabama, that big fancy dress. And the grandmother is trying to embody that in some ways. In some sense, she's kind of representative of that Old South. She sees, a little bit later, she sees a black child and uses the N-word to describe him. And this is a really problematic scene. She talks about how the grandchild points out that he didn't have any breeches on. If you're not from the South, breeches are pants. And the grandmother says, she uses the N-word to describe him, the little boy, and says, probably because he didn't have any. And then she says, if I could paint, I'd paint that picture. So she sees a black child with no pants on and is like, oh, isn't that precious? And honestly, that's like kind of disturbing, and we should be disturbed by this. That's what Flannery O'Connor wants us to think, like, wait a second, this is somebody's grandmother. She seems pretty nice overall, but then she uses the N-word and acts like, man, don't you miss, isn't that a pretty picture of this poor black child? And you're kind of like, probably not. Like, that's actually not something that I would think, like, I would want to hang in my house as a picture of a poor black child, or poor, like, to look at poverty with nostalgia is kind of a problem. She also wants to go visit a plantation, if you remember. which again, like an ideal or an idyllic representation of the past. She also sort of makes fun of another African American on the next page. She talked about her old boyfriend, whose name was Edgar Atkins Teagarden, and his initials spelled E-A-T, which is funny, and he would carve E-A-T into the watermelon he gave her every day. And some African American, who she uses the N-word to describe, but ate the watermelon because he read eat and thought it was okay to eat it, but really that was the guy's initials. And so it's like poking fun, you know, at an African American man. When the dude, if you saw a piece of fruit that said eat on it, you would also think it means eat. You know, the irony here is that he's the African American man is the one who actually is like knowing he's taking the right social cue. There was just underlying context that he wouldn't have had access to that made it a joke. So you have like kind of 3 strikes against her in terms of her perception of people of race. Okay, so that complicates her as a character. You know, she seems like somebody's grandmother, but then you read further and you're like, oh wow, she's kind of like sort of awful. She does also lie to the family about the plantation. She talks about there being a secret door or like a alcove or something to kind of incentivize them wanting to go. And it says in the text that she knew that wasn't actually true, but she was just trying to get her way so much. So, I mean, that's kind of shady too. But where she gets to be extremely confusing as a character is when she meets the misfit on the side of the road. So this is a little bit later, after they've had the accident, which she technically causes because she makes the cat, you know, she irritates the cat, it jumps up, and Bailey ends up having an accident in the car. She also speaks up and recognizes the misfit. So it's like, come on, lady, you're causing problem after problem after problem. And what he says is, it would have been better for all of you, lady, if you hadn't have recognized me. So we enter with this character. Let's talk about the misfit then. So he is, as I've said already, this criminal that's supposedly on the loose. But what we learn about him when we actually meet him is that he's a little bit more complicated than we might have thought. So he talks about having been a gospel singer. He says, I've been most everything, been in the armed services, both land and sea, at home and abroad, been twice married, been an undertaker, been with the railroads, plowed Mother Earth, been in a tornado, seen a man burned alive. And then he also says, I've even seen a woman flogged. That's a pretty long list of things to have been, exposed to. He even goes as far as to say that he can't even remember why he went to jail. He says that he was accused of having killed his father, but he remembered his father dying from the flu pandemic. So he can't even really remember the context of his arrest and why he's in trouble. So it's not as clear what kind of villain he is, if that makes sense. So what I'm trying to say is, what you would think is that if there's an old lady and a burglar who kills her, the burglar's the bad guy and the lady is the good person. And what this story does is it kind of complicates that. The grandmother isn't so good, and then the misfit seems to have, we can kind of have empathy for him. He kind of confuses us. He even says some very strange things about religion. I made a note of this in the discussion board, so I'm going to say it twice. Flannery O'Connor herself, the writer here, she's from Georgia, but she was deeply religious. She was Catholic, actually. And she was, I don't think I've said any of this yet, but she was actually very sick. She had lupus, and she spent a lot of her time just ill. And she died early, actually, in Milledgeville is where she was from, but she was born in Savannah. But her experience in life was, kind of typical of what you would think about somebody living in the South. And she did have a very strong religion, but she also, think about too, if she's writing this in the 50s, she's writing this pre-MLK, pre-social justice reform, the 60s were kind of when all that stuff happened. So she's writing like during segregation. So she's trying to, she's kind of ahead of her time in that sense, right? To critique the grandmother for being racist is a kind of ahead of her time, especially in the South. But not only is she willing to kind of put herself out there in that direction, she also is a little bit critical of religion, even though she's devout herself. So let's kind of look at some of those examples. And again, this is why I think she's such an interesting person, Flannery O'Connor. is the fact that, you know, she didn't write a short story that just condemns religion. She was part of the thing that she's critiquing. That's always rare, that you can find somebody who both believes and embodies the thing, but is also able to kind of like look at the thing upside down and say, okay, there's some issues here. So what she does to complicate this is she creates the misfit who refuses to pray. So the grandmother says, you know, if you would pray, Jesus would help you. And then he says, that's right. And she says, why don't you pray? And he says, I don't want no help. I'm doing all right by myself. So then she continues to say, okay, but you should pray, blah, blah, blah. And then he kind of gives her like a philosophical talking to. He says, Jesus, and it's written in dialect. So he says, Jesus thrown everything off balance. It's the same case with him as with me. He hadn't committed any crime they could prove. I had committed one because they had papers on me. And he said, of course, they never show me the papers. That's why I signed myself now. I said long ago, you get a signature and sign everything you do and keep a copy of it. Then you'll know what you've done, and you can hold it up to the crime of punishment and see that they match. And in the end, you'll have something to prove because you ain't been treated right. I call myself the misfit because I can't make what all I done right fit what I've gone through for punishment. And so he continues on from there. He says, Jesus was the only one that ever raised the dead, and he shouldn't have done it. He thrown everything off balance. If he did what he said, then it's nothing for you to do but throw away everything and follow him. And if he didn't, then it's nothing for you to do but go enjoy the few minutes you got left the best way you can by killing somebody or burning down his house or some other meanness. No pleasure but meanness. So he shows sort of like a knowledge about what the premise of Christianity is. So it's not like he's ignorant in this sense, but he actually is willing to say, it actually doesn't make sense to me. You know, that's what's key about him that's kind of like alarming, is that he's not just resistant to something he doesn't know about, but he does have knowledge, and that he's still willing to kind of throw it away. But what's interesting here too is that he even convinces the grandmother to question her own devotion. As soon as he says, you know, Jesus has thrown everything off balance by raising the dead, if he actually did that, the grandmother responds by saying maybe he didn't raise the dead. She actually becomes sort of confused herself. You can read that moment with the grandmother as her feeling confused and then kind of hypocritical, or you can read it as her like only being willing to denounce her religion for her life, because in this moment she's kind of pleading for her own life. So she kind of has like a revelation, like, okay, maybe this, either she has a revelation and thinks maybe what I believe isn't true, or it's not worth it to keep believing in this thing if I'm going to die for it. So either of those things kind of, again, complicate her goodness. What changes again, though, goes back and forth, is right after that, when she looks at the misfit, she says, you're one of my babies. You're one of my own children. She kind of, instead of what most scholars say about that scene in particular, was that, you know, again, this good and bad dichotomy, instead of her thinking about herself as the good person at the end of the story, she actually comes around and is like, okay, maybe I'm not better than you. Like, you are my own child. I recognize you as like the same as me. Well, what it takes for her to do that is to be shot. And that's why the misfit says she would have been a good woman if somebody had been there to shoot her every minute of her life. Because when it came down to the last moment, when she was facing life or death, she was able to critique her religion, which Flannery O'Connor says is a good thing, to kind of have those questions. And then also she's able to identify with someone who she thought was different from her. So that it takes, again, a bullet or like a gun to her head to actually have that sort of revelation. So for her to become a good woman, it takes the last moment of the story and her own death. And, you know, some scholars argue too that the misfit kind of becomes a good person at the end, because his last line is, it's no real pleasure in life, after having shot her. And before he had said, there's no pleasure but meanness if Jesus wasn't real. He's like, if Jesus isn't real, we can just be mean and it doesn't matter. And now he just did a bad thing. He shot somebody, and he goes, there's still no pleasure here. So there's a suggestion that he might become good from this horrific scenario. Those are a lot of things happening in a very short story. And I know that like even my explanation of it can still be sometimes like, wait, what? But what you should think about more, like if you want to boil it down, which maybe isn't fair, but if you wanted to, you could think about the story as one that complicates the notions of what's good and what's bad. And it also critiques some of the traditions of the South, including devotion, blind devotion to religion, blind devotion, like not a critical devotion or a thoughtful devotion, but like just like blind allegiance. And then also that kind of like holier than thou mentality that the grandmother has is being critiqued, especially in terms of her perception of people of color from her like status as like a white woman and looking down on Black people. Flannery O'Connor's critiquing that. So that would be my tiny little thesis if I had to say basically what it's about. But you can see that it's so layered and complex as you like actually dig into the story. So, all right, this video is pretty long now because I had to talk about the class and this story, but I hope my explanation helps. Do the best you can on this discussion. We will talk about the story some more in person next week when we watch the documentary. And I think watching the documentary will help you kind of understand what Flannery O'Connor was like as a person, and then therefore what her stories are kind of trying to do. But yeah, we'll get all that caught up next week. So you guys have a good week. I'll plan on seeing you a week from tomorrow in our TLC room, and we'll talk again soon.